So as we move up in the 1900s, we progress towards dictatorship. Again, you had lots of discontent under early democracy. And so what happens is you've got massive infighting and you've got an ungovernable country. And so who steps in when you've got an ungovernable country? Ding, 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 the military, right? So we've got a pattern forming here. So the military comes in and they install President Vargas, who appoints new governors, ones that he can actually keep under his control. He adopts a new constitution which reduces the state powers. In other words, it centralizes power. So, for example, the states couldn't tax on their own anymore. And within a few years, he has more or less abandoned democracy with support. So it wasn't just him abandoning democracy and people protesting. He had support from industrialists, from middle-class professionals, from workers, from the military. And why would that happen? Well, again, you had discontent with early democracy because of all the problems in governance. So again, another key lesson to keep in mind, because we find this frequently in new democracies. And what happens under Vargas is he introduces corporatism, where we've got these unofficial unions that are harassed, and you've got the creation of these official unions. So again, corporatism, referring back to the system where the government comes to the table of business and labor, but business and labor are co-opted. These are organizations, what we call peak organizations. The government will assign this organization to represent labor, and so you are the one labor organization, and you are our buddies. Same with business. This allows for the creation, though, of a populist regime because you can easily mobilize labor. If you own the unions, you can mobilize labor. And they also do things like raising wages, giving welfare benefits to workers, modernizing the military, creating a special school for them. So all of these things are arguably, they're things that the population's not going to oppose. Just because the population doesn't oppose doesn't mean it's good policy. It doesn't mean that it's a tenable policy. Now, after World War II, Vargas decides he's going to allow for some more political parties. So he begins to loosen this sort of authoritarian streak, and he increases democratization. But the military, which is always standing behind there, wants to keep control so that things don't go too far. And this leads to the Second Republic in 1945. The military steps in, and they decide that they're going to be the ones who establish a degree of democracy, but with the military as a custodian. So we still have the continuation, this major democratization push. You've got a huge expansion of suffrage. Political competition becomes real. You've got various political parties representing true ideologies and different constituencies. You've got a real legislature. Now the problem is that real legislature prompts deadlock with the president. And so again, you run into some problems. Now, at this point, there's a general who's president from 1945 to 1951, but then Vargas is reelected in 1951, and he remains in power for a while after that. In 1961, a populist left-wing president, Goulart, G-O-U-L-A-R-T, whose name is right down here, takes power, and this leads to inflation, and it leads to debt. And when you have a left-wing president in the 1960s, you've got lots of worries of foreign intervention. And we've seen this before, right, in the 1950s with Mossadegh in Iran. And here, of course, so the UK and the US were behind that. And here's the US. The US comes up and they back a military coup in 1964. So thanks to the United States, we've got the military coming to power again. And this is a picture of the military coup back in 1964. What's interesting about this, and what's important to know about this, is that for the first time, the military stays in power. And they stay in power for about 2 decades. This isn't the traditional sort of military comes in and hands power back over. This is the military comes in and wants to maintain power and won't relinquish power for 2 decades. And this is a period of bureaucratic authoritarianism, where they ban political parties, they create 2 official ones, they limit civil liberties by decree, and they become serious human rights abusers. It doesn't mean that they're just sitting there reaping all the profits. This is a military regime that wants to put the country back on track. That's what military regimes say they want to do. And so their focus here is on economic rebirth through state-led industrialization. And they do this through major infrastructure projects, including dams. They create a highway that goes through the Amazon. And the result is this economic miracle where you've got 10% growth per year for a while, throughout the 1960s, really. The military has allies. It's not just running the show on its own. Some of the allies who are interested in this, well, you've got these technocrats within the bureaucracy, and then you've got the conservative business elites. This is great business. This is a great business environment. Living under a left-wing government which threatens nationalization and all sorts of state interference in the economy isn't great for the conservative business elites. So the military has allies. Now, in the 1970s, the economy begins to slow. You've got an increased debt. You've got inflation on the increase. And so, as per almost protocol, the opposition grows increasingly vocal. In 1979, President Figueiredo comes to power, and he's in power until 1985, so about 6 years. And during his period of rule, he releases political prisoners, he increases tolerance of the opposition, and gradually accepts reforms. And the military gradually moves back to the barracks. In 1988, you have a new constitution that's passed in Brazil. So I want you to think about how the evolution of democracy, and this is the constitution that remains today. So this 1988 constitution is the advent of democracy, or the latest round of democracy, at least in Brazil. So think about how this might be similar to or different from the Mexican case. Hopefully you're thinking about this in depth. Well, I'll throw out a couple ideas. Think of the role of the economic crisis in liberalization. Think of the role of the military. How does that differ from the role of the military in the Brazilian versus the Mexican cases? Think about other things. Right. Thank you. Thank you for thinking. Okay. Let's go into the Constitution now. Let me actually see how long we've been going for. 6:49. Let's just keep going. We're on a roll. So the Constitution here is based on federalism and separation of powers. And so it's a presidential system, as per a 1993 plebiscite, actually, which debated this. And so we'll talk about how this plays out. The Brazilian presidency is pretty important in a key way. So we'll start with the judiciary. The courts in the Brazilian case use the penal code. So there's not this broad interpretation that you find under common law. Lawyers actually contribute to the backlogs by dragging cases out as long as possible because they're actually paid based on the amount of time they spend on a case, not whether they win it or not. And so you've got these perverse incentives of lawyers, although I suppose we have that to some degree here as well. You pay by the hour in some cases. The local court systems are seen as corrupt, and they're also seen as controlled by economic elites. They're seen as not good for the ordinary person. So remember this when we talk about civil society. I'll flesh this out a little bit. But it has to do with the landless people's movement to a significant degree. So at the constitutional level, we're talking about the Supreme Federal Court, composed of 11 judges. This is their constitutional court. They stay into power. They stay in for I think about 30 years, 30-year terms. Up to 30 years. You've got here the concrete judicial review. So just like in our system, it's another place where you've got an overstretched Supreme Court, where tens of thousands of cases are coming to them, and they have to weed through and just pick a handful. So what you see here, the map that you see here, refers to where we have presidential systems and other types of systems. What I want to highlight, the blue systems are all presidential systems. And what you find is that presidential systems are dominant in the Americas, and then in some of the mostly less savory cases in Africa and Asia. In other words, where you have lots of strong-arm rule. The yellow countries here are semi-presidential systems, not very many of them. We've talked about two of them, right? France and Russia. The orange are parliamentary democracies. The red ones are parliamentary constitutional democracies. So believe it or not, the Canadians still like the Queen. And the green ones are presidential systems that are actually linked to parliaments. And so we'll talk about that in the case of South Africa in a few minutes. Also a very rare system. So again, note the dominance in the Americas by a presidential system and the dominance of Europe by parliamentary systems for the most part. Various types of parliamentary systems. And again, the red ones, parliamentary constitutional democracies, are really simply parliamentary systems. The monarchs tend to have very little power. Again, a case here is the UK, and we've talked about the UK case, where the monarch is really symbolic. So the red is a lot like the orange. So in the case of Brazil, we've got a president who comes to power for a 4-year term, 2-term max. The most important thing to remember about the Brazilian system, and this was actually debated in, I think in the 1990s in the United States, is this line item veto. It makes the president very powerful. What a line item veto is it's the ability to literally sculpt legislation, though sometimes this is subject to a legislative override. What the president can do is the president can handpick things that the president doesn't like. So Parliament, or in this case, this Congress, the Chamber of Deputies and the Federal Senate will pass legislation, and then the president can literally go in there and say, this is great except for this provision. And so this can be great when you think about it. It can help you deal with some costly things like all the pork barrel stuff that we talk about. And it can help the Parliament, the Congress people, congressional representatives save face. They can say, hey, we put it in there and he pulled it out. But it can also be, I'm sure you can also think of ways that it can be damaging, taking out integral parts of the law that otherwise the law wouldn't have passed without these. So again, the line item vetoes makes this a potentially very powerful president, although we'll talk about some problems in a couple seconds. The president also appoints his or her own cabinet. So we actually have the first the first female president in Brazil right now, Dilma Rousseff, who came to power in 2011, preceded by the guy you see up here, Lula da Silva, who we'll talk about in a second. The president can initiate legislation, and does, for the most part, about 80% of the time, at least under da Silva, this was initiated by the presidency. And the president has sole responsibility for the budget. Again, no purse strings for the legislature. That's important. So there is lots of formal power for the president between sole responsibility for the budget, initiating most of the legislation, having this line item veto. But in reality, the president in Brazil has been weakened by a historically fractionalized legislature with various parties that lack discipline. And often what this means is that the president has ruled by emergency decree. So De Moyo, for example, around 1999 to 2000, did 150 decrees, mostly economic reforms, because of the economic crisis. So he had a reason why. He had an alibi, I guess. Alibi is really the wrong word, but he had a reason to do it. And he simply couldn't get these things passed in the legislature, despite his powers. So you can initiate legislation, doesn't mean it's going to pass. You've got sole responsibility for the budget, but there's lots of other stuff that the economic system depends on, which you need legislation to deal with. So you can allocate the money, but what about the structural reforms, etc.? This is a majority SMD system, so the president, like state governors and mayors, has to get a majority in the first round or they head into a second round. So Lula da Silva is an interesting case. He's a founding member of the Workers' Party. He was elected in 2002, then re-elected in 2006. And so he was seen as a leftist. And at first you had economic instability. And remember, when a leftist comes to power in Brazil, we don't have a good history of that. The military sometimes says, hey, this is destabilizing. They step in. And there was economic instability. Foreign investors freaked out. They thought that something bad's going to happen. They're going to nationalize. They're going to do something bad. What they were really afraid of is that da Silva would default on Brazil's substantial loans to the IMF. But what happens when da Silva comes into power is he moderates his position. He actually pays back the IMF early rather than defaulting. He launches a growth acceleration program where there's investment in roads and railways. He simplifies the taxation system and reduces the tax load. He modernizes energy production. But a key thing to keep in mind here is moderation. And I've said this before. Usually if someone relatively far to the left or far to the right comes to power, once they get to power, they're going to moderate. And again, if they don't, well, you could be in for some bumpy weather. But they tend to do this. So again, President Dilma Rousseff is now president. She's the first female president. She was actually da Silva's chief of staff, so she's from the same party. The legislature is actually composed of two co-equal houses, so somewhat unusual. You've got the Chamber of Deputies with 513 representatives and the Federal Senate with 81 representatives. They're both strong in that they have to approve all legislation. They can amend the Constitution with a 2/3 vote in each one. They have periodic hearings of government officials. They can impeach the president. They did to De Moyo for a corruption case back in the early 1990s. But they're weak in that basically the legislature is seen as a stepping stone to good postings. So it's all about individual actors. There's very little party cohesion, and this weakens them as an institution. Most of the legislation, as I mentioned, is initiated by the president. So this is another sort of weakness. Doesn't mean they couldn't initiate the legislation, but perhaps one of the reasons they don't is for lack of this strong party system. The electoral system this is a great case, actually. It's the first one that we talked about where voting is mandatory from the age of 16. So you've got very high voter turnout, around 70%, relative to states without mandatory voting. Each state also sends 3 senators. So like in our system, the U.S. system, there's this overrepresentation of barely populated states. The voting system is actually a very unusual one. It's an open list PR. So voters choose either from the party list or they write in names of candidates that they want. The party votes and votes for members of the particular parties are tallied together and they're given proportional seats. But candidates campaign under their own names as well as their party logo, since seats for the individual party members are allocated based on the number of votes that they get. So the more votes for a party, let me rephrase this. More votes for a party individual can actually change their place on the party list. So for example, if the party puts you number 20 on their list, and then a lot of people vote you as their representative, then you can get pushed up to number 5 on the party list. Might not make the party leaders happy, but again, these aren't very coherent party systems. So again, think about what this means for party cohesion, how this party system might compare with others, say the UK and Japan. Well, clearly, this weakens the parties in favor of clientelism, pork barrel politics, because candidates are trying to save their own, butts, right? They're trying to save their own butts. They're trying to keep themselves in power. It's funny because I have no problem with light profanity in class, but somehow recording it doesn't seem nice. So in Japan's upper house, look at the MMD system. People vote for individuals rather than parties, and we've seen, again, this devastating impact on party cohesion there. So let's get into the parties. This is very much about the individuals, and so you have frequent party hopping. Actually, let me take this in a separate slide because I'm going on for a little bit of time.